Are you tired of dealing with third-party authentication providers? In today's video, I'll show you how to integrate Google Sign-in with Expo and Expo Router API routes in a secure manner while keeping control over your authentication. We'll set up a custom OAuth flow, restore user session, protect API routes, deploy with EAS hosting, and make it work across web, Android, and iOS. See the demo below if you want a taste of the final result. Let's dive in. Okay guys, so I want to give you an overview of what we're going to be doing. This is going to be a fairly long video, but I think it's going to be super helpful to give you an understanding of how OAuth flow works. We're going to be using Google in this video, but at the end of the day, you could apply the same logic for any other provider. So I think this is going to help you anyways. As always, you can find a live demo down here and the source code in the description below. So before we start coding, let's go over what we'll cover in this video. We'll implement a custom OAuth flow, we'll use Google Sign-in, we will handle JSON web tokens for native applications, and for web, we're going to be using cookies and secure our APIs as well, meaning that we will only return a response for authenticated users using the JWT. You'll also see how to deploy everything in seconds using EAS Hosting, customize the token expiration, and keep your secrets safe on the server. For this approach, we'll be using the BFF, also known as backend for frontend pattern, which is a design approach where the backend is tailored specifically for the frontend needs. Instead of exposing a generic API, this backend only handles what the client app requires, making authentication and session management more efficient and secure. If you find this video helpful and want to support the channel, subscribe and give it a like and leave me a comment below. By setting up authentication ourselves, we control the entire flow. No external dependencies, no vendor logged in, and full access to user data and customization. The approach I'll show you today is just one way of doing things, but feel free to research and tweak some parts of the flow based on your needs. Also, if you have any suggestions, let me know in the comments. Just want to mention one more time, our authentication setup isn't limited to Google. You can easily extend it to support additional providers like GitHub, Apple, or Twitter without modifying the entire system. OAuth is a standard authentication framework, meaning most providers follow the same flow. This makes it relatively easy to integrate multiple providers. Just check the documentation for the provider that you are interested in, but overall, OAuth structure should remain the same. Okay, so that's like a high overview of what we're going to be covering in this video. Now let's see the demo. Alright guys, so as you can see, I am here on the web deployed version of this example. And this is the deployed one, so I'm just going to head and continue with Google and select my Expo account, as you can see here. And ta-da! So for web, we're using cookies, like I said before, and if I reload, it's very fast and it's restoring the session, and you can see that my session is going to expire in 20 seconds. By the way, I set it to 20 seconds to debug easily, but a good time for the token to expire would be 15 minutes. In this case, the example is going to contain 2 tokens. One token is going to be the refresh token, and the other one is going to be the access token. So the refresh token, I set it to 30 days, but you could set it to 7 days, meaning that after 7 days, the token won't work anymore and the user would have to authenticate. Or you could also implement token rotation, meaning that each time that you refresh a token, you generate a new refresh token with a new expiration date. So in this video, we won't be covering how to handle the refresh logic, but the example code that you can find down here is going to contain this working example implementing the refresh token and the access token. So this is how it looks on web. And here we have the mobile app. As you can see, it also works on light mode and dark mode. So for native, this is how it looks. I'm just going to press continue with Google. And then it's going to ask me if I want to sign in to my local host. So in this case, this one is using the local host URL. But once you are ready to deploy this, or if you want right now, we could just use this endpoint that I have deployed right now. But just so that you know that this is going to work as well in the local host, let's go ahead and continue. This is how it looks. I'm just going to select my account. And this is how it looks. So the access token is going to expire in 20 seconds. This is because, just for testing, but in this case, we are not using cookies. For native, we are using just the JWT. JWTs work well for mobile devices since they are easy to store securely, especially with Expo Secure Store, while cookies provide better support for web by preventing cross-site request attacks. Okay, so now if you notice, we also have this protected route section. So meaning, so a couple things to notice here is that my session expired. So if I were to refresh the website, the session is going to get restored using the refresh token. And now I have access again for 14 seconds, right? So if I go ahead and fetch protected data, this is going to work as expected. But on the right, as you can see, my token already expired, meaning that if I fetch data, this is going to fail. And then in this case, actually, it's not going to fail because I have a fallback that is checking that if the request failed with the error token expired, then we want to refresh and then try again. And we can actually see this here if I open the network inspector and select fetch. So if you notice, my session expired. And what is happening under the hood is that if I fetch protected data, a couple of requests are going to be made. First of all, the data request is going to fail, and the error is going to be that we need to authenticate. So this means that the access token expired, and we are detecting that so that we are refreshing. This is the next request that you can see here. And then, we have the response successful, meaning that the session was restored. And here you can find information about my user. This is a custom JWT that we are generating. And finally, we are trying to fetch again the data, and this time it's going to work. This is how the response looks like, and this is what we're seeing here. This is, just protected data. And also, just to show you that this is using cookies, if I go to the application tab and then select this website, you can see that here we have the refresh token. So this is securely stored and managed by the browser, so we don't need to really worry about it. We just need to create a session endpoint just for web. And for native, we're going to be storing using Expo Secure Store. And when we refresh, we need to provide the refresh token and then save again the new access token. But yeah, it's going to work the exact same way as you can see here. The session is, restored. And if I reload the application, this is going to just keep me sign in all the time until my refresh token expires, meaning I cannot refresh anymore my session. At that point, I would need to sign in again. But right now, if I just sign out and reload, this is going to keep me sign out. Same for iOS. So if I refresh now, this is just going to keep me sign out. And for those who are wondering, does this work on Android? Yes, it does. And here we have the proof. This is how Android looks like. I'm just go ahead and refresh. Right now I'm signed in, but if I sign out, I can, going to work just fine. Going to take me out to the browser where I can select my account. And once I do that, it's going to take me back to the application with, 30 seconds, 20 seconds to make a request. So let's fetch protected data, and it works just fine. And if I reload, it's going to keep me signed in using Expo Secure Store. Okay, so that's the demo. If you are interested, please stick till the end. I think this video is going to be super helpful. So without further ado, let's dive in. Okay guys, so I created this little diagram to show you the flow that we are going to follow and overall how this is going to work and what we're going to cover in this video. So for those who are not familiar with the OAuth flow, this is going to help you as well to understand how this is going to work, not only with Google, but with other providers, right? So in the first place, we have the Expo app, right? The client side. And then we have now the ability to have API routes within our Expo application, thanks to Expo Router. So these API routes, once they are deployed, they are going to live somewhere else. This is also known as the server side, right? And we can have, we can do server stuff in these API routes. And then we also have the provider. In this case, we're using Google. So the authentication flow consists basically in 4 steps. The first, initial request. This is where the user presses the sign in button or continue with Google button. And in here, we're going to create an API route that is going to handle this by basically redirecting that request to Google. So we're going to redirect the request to Google, and this is where the user sees that screen where they can select the account that they want to sign in and they approve permissions, right? So once they approve permissions, as you can see here, we're going to redirect, or we're going to get a code from Google. And we can use this code to then exchange that for the user info, right? But this code is just a string of a bunch of characters. You could argue that we don't need to return that to the client, but in this case, we are going to return this authentication code to the client. And this is because I think it's a good approach, and it also separates concerns, because if getting the token fails, then we know exactly that we need to fix something about the authentication code, right? And then once we get this code, we can exchange it, meaning on the client, I get this code once I approve, then I use this code to send it back to my server, and we can use now in the backend this code to exchange that with Google. In this case, at this point, we're going to use the classic client ID and client secret from Google. This is going to identify our application, and given these credentials plus the authentication code that the user provide, Google is going to validate this information and then return something called ID token. This ID token as well is a bunch of characters. It's actually a token that contains the user information. So from here, once we have this ID token, we can actually just get the user info. And this is what we're going to do at this point here. Once we get this ID token, we're going to decode this token, and we're going to abstract the username, the user info, the user ID, whatever you need. So in our case, we're going to generate a custom JSON Web Token. But if you want to just handle everything directly with Google, you could use this ID token. And this ID token is going to contain an expiration date as well. And it's going to, you will need to refresh this directly with Google. But in our case, and it's actually a good thing that we can actually have full control in our server, is that we can just abstract the user info, which is what we need, and then generate a custom JSON Web Token that is going to have a custom expiration date. And then in this JSON Web Token, we can include formatted data according to our needs. So I can say user ID, username, and then grab the user ID from Google, grab the username from Google. And this is great because let's say that Google calls, full name to the name field, and Apple calls it just first name, for example. So in this case, we would have two different fields, right? But because we are generating our own JWT, we can just grab these two values from each provider at this point and just generate a custom JWT and send that to the client. And then for the request that the client creates to the server, we are going to validate this JSON Web Token. And this is, fully customizable. You can do whatever you need. Now, a couple things to notice here is that when we return this custom JSON Web Token, we're going to be using cookies for web. So the response is going to be a bit different. We're going to set that on the headers. And for the mobile applications or native, we're going to send just directly the JSON Web Token in the response. And then on the client, we're going to get this JSON Web Token and we're going to securely store it and then use that to authenticate for the request and get user info. And then for the web, we're going to be using the cookies. Okay. So I hope that makes sense. This consists only on 4 steps. First of all, initial request. Then we get the Auth token once the user approves. Then we use that token to exchange that with Google to get the ID token, also known as the user info at this point. And once we have the user info, we can do whatever we want, right? So in this case, we are delivering the token, but in this case, it's going to be a custom token. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. One more thing, guys, before we jump into the code. The only prerequisite for this, guys, is going to be to have a Google Cloud account, and we're going to come back to this in a moment, but just make sure that you already have one. As you can see, I'm using this project Talk GPT, which is the one that I'm using for testing, and this is like kind of the only requirement. And I want to walk you as well through some of the dependencies that we're going to be using. So first of all, since we're going to be generating our own JSON Web Token, we're going to be using this amazing package called Jose, which is a JavaScript module. But the cool thing about Jose is that allows you to generate JSON Web Token, validate, decode, and stuff like that. But this is optimized for Cloudflare workers. This is very important since Expo Router API routes run on Cloudflare workers, meaning that it is not like a full Node.js environment, and some other dependencies that rely on Node.js won't work on Expo API routes. So make sure that the packages that you are using on the API routes are compatible with Cloudflare workers. So in this case, Jose works amazingly fine, and it also works on the client, which is amazing. Okay, so that's Jose. Then we're going to be using as well Expo Secure Store to store the token on native, right? So we have this great documentation. You can come here and see, learn more about how Expo Secure Store works, and we're going to learn more in a moment. Then we're going to be using Expo Auth Session. Expo Auth Session is an amazing library that is going to allow us to create that initial request for signing in the user. It's going to allow us to redirect back to the application, and it comes with some hooks that abstract much of the logic that we will need to implement manually to just request, to create that first request to sign in the user. So Expo Auth Session manages that for us, and it works on Android, iOS, and web. Cool. And that's basically all we need, I think. Oh, okay, we're gonna be using as well Expo web browser, but actually this dependency I think comes installed in the default template. So you might already have it installed, but if you don't have it, just go ahead and install it. Expo web browser is going to just allow us to open that modal with like a web browser inside the application that is going to show the Google sign-in page. And that's basically all we need. So now that we know which dependencies we're going to need, now that we know that we need a Google Cloud account, let's go ahead and create a new project. Okay, so I'm here in my terminal in the folder that I want to create my project, and I'm going to be using Bon. So let's go ahead and say Bon, create Expo App, and the name is going to be Google OAuth video. So let's go ahead and hit enter. Okay, my project is ready, so I'm going to open this in Cursor. Alrighty guys, so here we have our project, and let's just go to the package.json. And I just want to show you that this template already comes with Expo web browser, meaning that we don't have to install it. So I'm just going to open the terminal and install the dependencies that we are going to be using. So let's go ahead and run npx expo install expo auth session, expo crypto, which is a pair dependency of expo auth session. And then let's also install expo secure store and Jose. So let's go ahead and hit enter. Okay, that's done. Let's just confirm that we have these dependencies in our project, as you can see here. Great. Now let's go ahead and run this reset project command, since right now this is using tabs and it's actually fairly complex in here. So let's go ahead and say bon run reset project. This is going to ask me if I want to move the existing files to an app example instead of deleting them. So I'm going to say yes, just in case we need something. This is the app example. Next, let's go to the app.json and scroll down to the web section. In here, we want to make sure that the output is equal to server, since we're going to be using API routes. So just change that to server and hit save. Also guys, if you want to go ahead and create a bundle identifier for your application, just come here and add it, as well as a package for Android. Yeah, and right now this is complaining because it has some dashes, so make sure that you don't use dashes for your package. So this is how it looks right now. Since we're going to be redirecting to different platforms like web and native, we need to make sure that we set a scheme for our project. So in my case, I'm going to say Google OAuth video. If you want to use Expo Go, that's totally okay. You just need to use the scheme for Expo Go. You can find that in the docs, by the way. For this video, I'm going to be using a development build, and this is going to be my scheme. Now, the next thing that I want to do, guys, is create a new .env.local file. This file is going to contain all the environment variables that we're going to be using across our application, and this is how it's going to look. So first of all, I want to set an environment variable for my base URL, since this is going to make it easier for us to change this later once we have a production URL. Okay, then I'm going to set the Expo public scheme so that we know where to redirect for mobile devices. And this is just the scheme that I just created in here. So when we're referring to the scheme, we need to add this colon slash slash. I also have a JWT secret and JWT refresh secret. This is because in the example, I created two JSON Web Tokens, one for accessing data for 20 seconds, as you saw, and the other one is to refresh that token, and this one has an expiration of 30 days in the example. But in this case, we won't be refreshing, but if you want, just go ahead and keep this in here if you're going to be following the example. But the JWT secret should be a string, ideally random string, and you could ask ChatGPT to generate a random string for your JWT secret, but this secret is going to be used to sign the JWT. So we can validate on the server that the JWT that the user is adding on the request is valid, right? And we can validate that it's valid because of this secret, okay? So this is going to be just used on the server. As you can see, this is not prefixed with Expo Public. All the Expo Public things that you can see here are going to be available on the client, meaning that everyone can access these variables. So make sure that you don't add any sensitive information like the Google client secret or Google client ID. You want to make sure that you keep those on the server, especially the client secret, okay? So right now, because we're using our own custom backend, we don't even need to have a client ID on the client side. The client ID is going to be used only on the server. So our Expo client app does not need access to Google credentials at all. So once we have this in place, let's go ahead and hit save. Now let's go to Google Console and get the client ID and client secret. Okay, so here I am on Google Cloud. As you can see, I'm using this TalkGPT project. Let's go ahead and create a new project by pressing this button, and I'm gonna give it a name. So I'm gonna say Google OAuth video and create. This is going to take a moment. Once this is done, let's press on select project. You can confirm that this is select by just checking that this is the name of the project. Once we have that in place, just open the menu bar on the left and go to the APIs and services, and then OAuth consent screen. You could go directly to credentials if you already have OAuth consent screen, but in this case, we don't have anything since we just created this project. So let's go ahead and create this consent screen. The consent screen is the screen that users see when they are approving access to our application. So let's just press get started. My app name is going to be OAuth example. I need to specify a support email, so I'm going to just select the default and press next. I'm going to set the audience to be external. Next. And I need to specify a contact. So I'm going to say veto@expo.io. And I agree, continue, create. That's done. I think now we can just go ahead and create a new OAuth client by pressing this button. And this is going to take us to this part where it says clients. So let's go ahead and select web application. And I'm going to call this Expo Router backend, since this is actually going to be just handled by the backend, right? So let's go ahead and add an Authorize JavaScript origin. This is going to be the domain of our application. So I'm going to say HTTP localhost 8081. This is for my localhost. Of course, once we deployed our website and API routes, we need to update this, right? So let's go ahead and just set that. And we also need to add an authorized redirect URI. So let's just copy this. Now, the authorized redirect URI, it's also known as a callback that we're going to get from Google on this specific step. So when Google returns the auth code, we need to handle this in the Expo Router server as well. So let's go back in here and let's say that we are going to handle this inside an API. So of course we haven't generated this API handler yet, but we're going to do it later. So let's go ahead and press create at the bottom. And once I press create, this is going to give me my client ID. So let's go ahead and copy this value and let's go to the code. This is my client ID. Let's paste it in here. And let's copy the client secret as well. So I'm just going to copy this in here and paste it in here. Hit save. These are going to be my credentials. Of course, guys, you don't want to share this. I'm just showing this because I'm going to delete this project after I finish recording, but be careful to don't share these credentials, okay? So let's go back and press OK. And now we have our server client registered with Google, meaning that we can now exchange codes for user info, okay, and authenticate users. So you can always come back here and update some things, and we're going to do that once we deployed our application. So let's go back to the code. Now we have all the environment variables that we need. And now next, I want to define some constant values that we're going to be using across our application. So for that, let's go in here and let's create a new file. I'm going to call this constants.ts. And I'm going to cheat a little bit by pasting some of the values that I'm going to be using across the application. So this constant basically allows us to centralize, and tweak things that are going to change the entire application. So for example, I'm defining, this is totally optional, of course, but it's a good practice, I think. I'm defining some things that we're going to need. For example, for web, we're going to need a name for the cookie that we're going to be storing. So in this case, my name is going to be auth token. We're going to need as well a refresh cookie name, and this is optional. We're not going to be covering this, but the cookie name is going to be refresh token. You need to provide this as well. So anytime that you want to change the name, you can just come here and this is going to change across the entire application, right? Now for testing, I'm setting the cookie max age to be 20 seconds, of course, because I don't want to wait 15 minutes to see if the refresh logic works. But you can come here and change this anytime, okay? Then I'm also setting the JWT expiration time to be 20 seconds. As you can see, the syntax, it's a bit different. Then I'm setting the refresh token to be 30 days, and you can change this as well if you want to, but we're not going to be covering the refresh in this video. Just so you know how you could do that. This variable is actually not relevant for this video, so let's go ahead and skip that. Then I'm also setting this constant to be Google Client ID, Google Client Secret, Google Redirect URI, which is going to be the Expo public base URL variable that we set in our environment. So meaning that the endpoint is going to be API auth callback, right? This is the redirect URI that we actually set on Google. And then we also have the Google Auth URL. This is their official API endpoint that we can hit to get to use OAuth, okay? So these are just constant values. And then we also have environment constants. For example, the base URL is going to be this one. Just using, a shorter name. This is totally optional. The app scheme, the JWT secret, and all these are secret values that we define in the end.local file. Then we have the cookie settings that looks like this. And here's where we are applying the max age for the cookie. And then we also have the refresh cookie options, which is the same thing, but applying a different max age. This is actually not super relevant for this video, but just so you know. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit save. Now we have the constants and we can actually start integrating Google Sign-in. All right, guys, so the next thing that I want to do is build my application. So let's go ahead and run npx expo prebuild. This is going to generate the Android and iOS folders. And something that I like to do is just go to my git ignore file and add these two files, since we're going to be using EAS and we're going to be generating this native code each time that we run prebuild. So we don't need to track that on GitHub. Okay, let's go ahead and run this on iOS by running run iOS and hit enter. Okay, so the build is going to take a couple minutes. The next thing that I want to do, guys, is create a context and provider that is going to handle the user state and methods that we can use across the application. So for that, let's go to the Explorer and create a new folder. So I'm going to call this folder context, and inside this context folder, I'm going to create an auth file. So I'm going to say auth.tsx. Okay, and my app is ready. As you can see on the right, I'm going to press open. This context is going to be in charge of handling all the authentication logic. So abstracting this from the components, it's a good idea. And then we can just import methods that we need or the user information in any component. So let's go ahead and create a context. First of all, I'm going to start by importing all as React from React. And down here, I'm going to call this auth context. Okay, so this is good. And then create context. Now I want to give this context a default value. So let's go ahead and start typing the data that this context is going to handle. For example, user. Then I want to expose methods like sign in, sign out. I'm also going to create a function that is going to allow me to create request, authenticated request. So adding this function inside this context that is going to have access to the JWT, it's a good idea. So let's call this function fetch with auth. So this function is going to be an async function, and we're going to pass the endpoint that we want to hit and some options, right? And this is going to return a promise dot resolve in response. Okay, this is how the type looks like. I also want to expose an isLoading variable. This is going to allow us to display an activity indicator while we handle authentication or refresh the user session. And finally, if we have an error, I want to be able to access it as well. This error is going to be of type auth error, which we can actually import from Expo Auth session. And I'm going to say or null, right? So it's a good idea to have a type for the user. In this case, I'm going to type the user as follows. I just took the structure from Google, but you can tweak this as you want. If you want to change the properties and then map the properties accordingly once we get the response from Google, you can do that as well. And this is how the user is going to look. And actually this information is going to be inside the JSON Web Token. Some important things to notice here is going to be the provider, which is Google in this case. This is the only one we have, but then in the future, if you want to add more, just it's going to change for Apple or things like that. Then the expiration of this token and cookie expiration. And this is to track the expiration of the web cookie. Now, before I go down, I want to as well import all as web browser from Expo web browser. And in here, I'm just going to call web browser maybe complete auth session. And this is a method that we should call on the component or page that is going to handle the sign in. So this is going to help us to redirect the user to authenticate with Google. Okay, let's scroll down. So now let's go to the value and then we can provide the data. Okay, now TypeScript is not complaining, but of course these values are going to be always null and empty functions. So we need to create those in here. I'm going to start by creating a user. The user is going to be using useState as well to track the state of the user. This is of type auth user or null. Then we also have the isLoading variable, the error, and we can keep track of those variables using just useState. Then down here, let's create this sign in. For now, let's just leave it as it is so that we can just pass the values. So we can now come down here and update this. Okay, so now here we are passing directly these variables that are going to be changing. But now TypeScript is complaining about this fetch with authentication because it should return a response, and right now it's not returning anything. So let's just leave it as it is for now. Down here, I'm going to create a hook called use auth. And this hook is going to allow me to access the context. And this is how it looks. So first of all, it's just validating if we are not using a context and someone is trying to use this hook, we are going to throw this error saying that use auth must be within an auth provider, right? And in here, we're using just the auth context that we created above, right? So this is the auth context that we're passing. And yeah, this is how it looks in here. At the end, we're just returning the context. This means that we can simply import this use auth hook and we don't need to, call use context every time that we want to use the context. Just call this and this is going to return the state. Okay, so at this point, we can actually just go ahead and use this context. So let's go to the entry point of our application and let's import the auth provider and let's wrap our application. Okay, so this is how it looks. Now I can just go to my index screen and I should be able to use auth, right? All these methods that we get in here for free. Let's go ahead and import the hook from our context. And then we can say, based on these, for example, I'm just going to stringlify the user, which should be null at this point, and we can see it on screen. Now, actually, I don't want to access all these things in here. I just want to access the isLoading and the user. So let's go ahead and get rid of these functions. Now, for this simple example, guys, I'm going to be validating the user and then render accordingly because I'm only going to have one screen. But if you have, many screens, it's a good idea to create segments. And we actually have a guide on how to create an authentication flow with segments in the Expo documentation. So make sure to check it out. So in here, we can now have some render logic. I'm not going to be displaying an error, just checking if we are loading. I'm going to, just have a view from React Native that is going to center items. And instead of rendering this, we can have an activity indicator. We can import this from React Native as well. And I don't want to specify these variables, just a simple activity indicator, and that should do it. So now if I set this is loading to be true in my auth, let's see, it's loading. We can set this by default to true so that we can test this scenario. And as you can see, this is how it's going to look. So let's set this to false and let's go back to the screen. Okay, so now after this, we can actually validate if we don't have a user. It means that the user is not authenticated. So at this point, I want to return my login form. Okay, and we don't have a login form yet. So let's go ahead and create a new folder in here called components. And inside these components, I'm going to create a login form.tsx. Of course, the login form should be, really nice UI, but for now, I'm just going to have a simple button. So I'm going to say export default function login form. Let's import just a simple view from React Native and a text as well. And I'm going to import a button. Okay, so down here, I'm going to say sign in with Google. And then we can use the method from the hook, right? So let's import this from the context and let's center this. Okay, so let's hit save. Now let's go back and let's import this component. So we are importing these from components. And now if I hit save, because the user is not authenticated, I'm able to see the sign in with Google. But if I press, of course, it's not going to do anything yet. But now, once we pass, if we were to pass this, right, if we had a user, it means that we are going to render this piece of code. So it's just going to render the user, and then we can also have a button to sign out the user if we want to. So I'm going to just use this function from the use auth. So as you can see, using a provider keeps the components very clean and allows us to just go directly to the rendering part instead of, calling all this logic and setting the loading state. We can do that in the auth.tsx. Okay, so now everything is in place. Now we need to implement the actual logic for each function. I'm just quickly going to go to this stack and say that I don't want to show the header. So let's set this to false. And now this looks a bit better. Okay, now let's go ahead and start creating our sign-in API route. So let's go ahead and create a new folder in here. And I'm going to call this API. So inside this folder, I'm going to have a bunch of APIs, right? But inside this API, I want to create a new folder for the APIs that are going to be related to authentication. So let's call this folder auth. So inside auth, I'm going to create an authorize.ts file. We have to say plus API so that Expo Router knows that this is going to be an API, right? So this is the authorize endpoint, and we're going to hit this API to redirect the user to the Google sign-in page where they can approve access. So I'm going to say export async function get. In this case, we're going to need to have the Google ID. So I'm going to say if we don't have a Google client ID, then let's throw an error. That is going to be Google client ID is not set. But actually, instead of throwing an error, I want to return a response.json that is going to look something like this. The next thing that I want to do is grab the URL from the request. So I'm going to say URL equal to new URL, and I'm going to grab this from the request.url. This is actually totally optional since I'm going to be setting this to be Google, but I had this idea of validating if this is Google and handle Google accordingly. But if we have Apple, for example, we can set this to be Apple and then handle the authorization accordingly. So we can call this IDP client. This is going to be of type string, and then I'm going to set this value depending on the search params. Then I'm going to create as well a internal client, grabbing this from the client ID in the search params. And then I also need to grab the redirect URI. So all these values are going to come from the request. Then after this, we need to handle according to the platform. So let's create a platform variable, and then we can validate where we need to redirect the user based on the platform. So I'm going to say if redirect URI is equal to the app scheme. So this means that we are on native, right? I'm going to set the platform to be mobile. You can set it to be native, wherever, it doesn't really matter. Else if the redirect URI is equal to the base URL, this means that the platform is web. Otherwise, we can return invalid redirect URI. So keep that in mind. We have to, pass a platform when we are creating the request. So the next thing that I want to do is create this state variable and then append the platform to this state so that when we get the callback, we know which platform created this request, and based on this platform, we can redirect back. Okay, now the next thing that I want to do is actually validate if the request is for Google authentication, right? So in this case, I can simply say if the internal client ID, which is this variable, it's equal to Google, then I want to set the ID, IDP client ID, which is my variable that I have here. So let me just go ahead and update the name for this variable setting here. So this is the client ID that I'm going to use for this specific request. In this case, we're only handling Google. I think this is a bit overkill, but it's a good idea to give you, more context on how you can handle multiple providers. So in this case, I'm validating, is this Google? Okay, then use the Google client ID. Then after this, I'm going to generate the parameters that I'm going to pass to Google so that they show the correct, consent screen and the correct things, right? So that the user can approve. First of all, we need to specify the client ID. So I'm setting this in here. Then the redirect URI. Redirect URI, if you remember, we have the constants, and let me put this to the right, which is actually this one. So let's go ahead and use Google redirect URI in here instead of having, this concatenation that is not needed. I'm going to import this directly. And then the response type is going to be code. Remember that we're going to get the code, and then once we have the code, we can exchange that for the ID token. Scope is actually going to be set on the client. So we are simply just setting this to whatever the client is sending on the scope parameter. Otherwise, if they are not setting the scope, I'm going to set this to be identity, which is going to return just the user information. Then we pass the state. The state, remember guys, it's like the state of the request that is going to actually include as well the platform so that we can redirect, right? Now we can also tweak these parameters based on the documentation on Google, but basically I set this prompt to be select account, meaning that each time that the user presses sign in with Google, I'm going to prompt them to select an account. You can dismiss this by commenting or just deleting this prompt. And this means that if the next time that the user tries to authenticate, if they had a previous session, they are going to directly sign in, so they don't have to select. But I think it's a good idea, especially for testing, to prompt the user. So once we have these parameters, we can redirect the request to Google. So I'm going to say return response.redirect. Let's pass the Google OAuth URL. This is the official Google URL. And then let's concatenate these parameters. So I'm going to grab these params, and then we need to change this to be string, and let's hit save. So this is how it looks. Let me go ahead and close this so that you can see. This effectively is going to redirect to the Google sign-in page with all these things in here. An advantage of this is that we're actually just abstracting the client ID and we are handling this on the server. Once the user authorizes, we're actually going to get a request from Google to this URI, right? So let's go ahead and actually create this callback. Let's go to the auth folder, and I'm going to call this one callback plus API.ts. Let's export a sync function. This is going to be a GET request. So from here, let's grab the incoming params. We can grab this by saying new URL search params, and then pass the request URI and split where we have the question mark. And then let's grab position 1. This is going to return the combined platform and state. So from the incoming params, I want to get this state. Now down here, we can say if we don't have a combined platform state, we can say return response.json, passing an error, invalid state. I can also set the status to be 400. All right, I think we can have this in a single line. Now at this point, we need to abstract the platform, right? So I'm going to grab that from the combined platform and state, And if you remember, we actually did that in here, right? So right now we are grabbing the platform in here so that we know where to redirect the user, and the state is going to be in position 1. So we are splitting this and grabbing these values. Now remember that Google is going to return the code, so we need to grab that from the parameters. So I'm getting the code in here, parsing that to string, otherwise an empty string, and then I'm passing the state as well. Finally, we can return. This is going to be a new redirect based on the platform. So I'm going to say if the platform is equal to web, then we need to return to the base URL. Otherwise, we need to return to the app scheme. Then I'm going to concatenate the parameters. So I can say plus outgoing params to string. Okay, and this is how it looks. We are importing these from the constants. So that means that once we get the code, we're going to redirect to the application and the user is going to have the code. So once the user gets this code, then they are going to send this back again to us so that we return the ID token, right? So let's go ahead and create a new file in the auth folder, and I'm going to call this token plus API.ts export async function, and this is going to be actually a post handler. So this is going to get a request. Okay, and we're going to implement this in a moment. So right now we can actually go to the auth context, and we should be able to now initiate the sign-in process and even get the token, right? So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go to the sign-in part in here. So the first thing that I want to do here, it's actually use a very useful hook from Expo Auth session. So let's go ahead and import use auth session. This hook is going to return us a request, a response, and a prompt async function. Now this is going to take a config and a discovery. So for that, let's go ahead and create this config and discovery of here. Let me paste this in here. Actually, I have a bunch of comments in here so that we all know what's going on. Let's go ahead and import this type from Expo Auth session and this one as well. So first of all, guys, the config that we are passing in here for the auth request needs to set the client ID. So in this case, I'm setting this to Google, but if you are going to have multiple providers, you can set this to be Apple, right? Now, the scopes, if you remember, we are setting these on the client and we are passing these directly to Google on the server. So I'm passing the OpenID, profile, and email, which is just the regular information for authenticating the user. And then we're also passing the redirect URI. This is going to change depending on the platform. So we can simply use this make redirect URL helper function from Expo Auth session. So let's go ahead and import that. This is going to return the localhost 8081 for web and the scheme for native, right? And if it's deployed, of course, it's going to return the deployed one. Now, if you remember in the Authorize endpoint that we have in here, we are grabbing all this information, right? We are validating that the request is for Google, right? And then we are passing the scopes that we are adding in here. So use auth session is going to make all the requests for us. We just need to specify these parameters. And then for the discovery, we just need to specify the, endpoint to hit for the authentication, which is going to be Authorize, which is this API. And then the token endpoint, which is the one that we just created, but it's not quite ready yet, right? So let's go ahead and hit save. You can pause the video and read the comments if you're curious, but yeah, we just need to specify the authorization endpoint, the token endpoint, and the scopes and the client ID and redirect URI. Once we have that, we can just go ahead and call this function prompt async to prompt the user. So in the sign in function, what I'm going to do, just create a try catch. If we have an error, I'm just going to put in the console, and inside this try, first of all, I want to validate if we don't have a request. We can just return, and we can even say console log no request. If we do have a request, I'm going to say await and then prompt async. Okay, so let's hit save, and that's basically all we need to do. Let's go now to the index screen, and in here where we are showing the login form, let's go to the login form. Actually, we're already calling the sign in, and actually I can just simplify this by saying sign in like this, and hit save. So let's test this out. I'm going to press sign in with Google. And as you notice, we get this confirmation. Let's confirm. And this is taking me to the auth example. So this is my consent screen that we created before. And from here, I can, just select my account, and this is going to take me to the authorization. Before I approve those changes, let's go back to the auth context. I'm going to create this function candle response, which is going to actually receive the response from this hook. So what I'm going to do here is just say if response dot type equal to success, then it means that it worked. So I can say const equal to response dot params, and I can destructure the code that we're going to return from the response. So let's put this in the console so that we can see that this is working. We can also say else if the response dot type equal to error. If something went wrong, I can simply set the error to be equal to response dot error, and I'm going to cast this as auth error so that we don't have TypeScript issues. So now we need to actually call this function in a use effect. So let's go ahead and create a use effect, and I'm going to run this use effect every time that the response changes. So in here, I just want to say handle response and hit save. So let's see if this works. I'm going to clear the terminal and just continue. Okay, and I don't see anything here. Let's go ahead and reload the application. Maybe the changes didn't reflect. Just I'm gonna say sign in with Google, continue. This is going to prompt me again. And once I select my account, this is going to bring me back. And as you can see here, we have the code. So once we have this code, we can send it back to the backend and then exchange that for the ID token of the user. So let's go ahead and do that. So in here, I'm going to have a try catch. If we have an error, I'm just going to put it in the console. Because we're going to, do a fetch request in here. We're going to exchange the code. So we're going to exchange the code. So the first thing that I want to do here is just say set is loading equal to true. And then just copy this and say finally set is loading equal to false. Okay, cool. So inside of this try, I want to exchange the code. So let's go ahead and create a form data by using this form data class. So this form data is going to be sent to the token endpoint, and it's going to contain the platform that is sending this request, as well as the code that we want to exchange. So I'm going to say form data dot append. First of all, the code, that's the important thing. And then we want to append the platform. So let's go ahead and check the platform. So let's say if it's web, then append web. And this is how it looks. Native is actually not necessary because on the API, we are going to say if the request does not provide a platform, it means that it's native. Okay. Okay, so we need to say is web, right? We need to get this value somewhere. So I'm going to say const is web equal to, let's use platform from React Native. So if this is true, then is web, right? Okay, so after this, we should be good to say const token response equal to await fetch. Let's hit the base URL API auth token, and let's pass some options. Method is going to be post. Body is going to be just the form data. Credentials, it's going to be, if it's web, include, otherwise same origin. This is to include cookies on web. Hey, it's Beto from the future, and I just came, guys, to let you know that this is actually not super required. You could keep this piece of code to fetch the auth token and exchange if you want to, but actually after receiving some feedback, it's also possible to utilize exchange code async, which is a helper function that we can import from Expo Auth session, as you can see here. So if we go back to the code, this would actually simplify a little bit our request. Since this exchange code function receives two parameters, the discovery that we already had before from when we created the first request, And then we can pass the parameters, and this function is going to construct the query and form, meaning that if you decide to follow this approach, although the video is going to continue using this approach, but if you decide to use this instead, you could actually get rid of this section and form data entirely, since we're not going to be using it anymore. So after we get the response successfully, we can start exchanging the code following this pattern. We're going to pass as well the platform on the extra parameters that we can define in here. And then the client ID remains Google, the redirect URI remains the same, and we are passing the code that we just got from the response in here. And then once we have that, I'm just putting this in the console, and then we can validate accordingly. So for web, we're going to have the session, and for native, we can access the access token like this and set it directly. Okay, so another quick note before I let you continue with the video is that if you decide to use that approach, you're going to need to change the token response a little bit. This is how it looks now. So we have to set the access token with this name field so that this function can handle this correctly. But if I go ahead and hit save and reload quickly here on the right side, this is working now because I'm coming from the future, but just wanted to show you that this approach also works if you decide to use this. And as well, guys, this approach using the exchange code async function is going to work as well on web. And here we have the proof of the final result using this approach. This is going to set as well, if I quickly opened just to show you the application and cookies, this is going to set the cookies, meaning that if I refresh, we're going to be using these cookies for further request. So if you continue the tutorial just using this approach, at the end of the day, it should work just fine. And we can fetch protected data. And okay, at this point, as you can see, the cookie disappeared because I had the expiration for 20 seconds. But if I reload, and yeah, I need to sign in again. But if I sign in again and then fetch protected data, I'm able to get the data. Okay, so that's it. Let's continue with the video. Sorry for the trouble. So for web, the server is going to set the cookies on the server side, and we need to handle this response accordingly. So we can say if it's web, then we're going to handle this accordingly. Otherwise, if this is for native, we can just grab the token from the response. So I'm going to say await token response.json and say const access token equal to token.access token. So once we have this access token, we can use it to authenticate request, and it's a good idea to store it somewhere else. So I'm going to create a new variable. Okay, so then we can come down here and say set access token equal to this access token. If you want, we can just validate if we actually have an access token, we can do that. And this is how we can do it. Now here we need to save this token, and also we need to get the user info. So actually, instead of having this in here, I think it would be better if I put this in here and have an early return. So I'm gonna say if we don't have an access token, then just return, and we can put in the console. So save token is going to require local storage, and get user info, it's going to require us to use Jose. If you remember, we have this Jose that allows us to decode tokens. So we can say const decoded equal to Jose, and let me just go ahead and import from Jose. Okay, now if I come back, I can say Jose dot decode JWT, and then we can pass the access token. And once I have this info, I can set the user to be decoded as Auth user. Okay. Cool. So at this point, we would have a fully typed user authenticated, right? And we can access this information on any component. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit save. Now let's go ahead and save the token locally, right? So for this, let's go ahead and create a new folder in my root. So I'm going to just press this and create a utils folder. And inside this folder, let's go ahead and create a new file, and let's call it cache.ts. Let's go ahead and import Secure Store, and I'm going to import platform as well, since Secure Store only works for native. So we have to make sure that we are not going to be importing this on our website. So I'm going to import platform from React Native. Okay, let's say create token cache. This is going to be an arrow function that is going to return get token function. All these are going to be helper functions. So this is going to return a promise that is going to return a string or null. And to get a token, we need to have a key. The key is going to be a string. So we need a get token, then save token, and delete token. When we sign out the user, we need to delete the token. So to save, we need to get the key as well as the actual token that we need to save, and it's going to be of type string. And this is how the type looks like. If you want to clear this up, let's go ahead and remove this and maybe create a type. Oh yeah, and I actually have a typo. Okay, let's replace this. Again, that's a type, and then we can say token cache. Okay, that looks so much better. And let's hit save. Now let's implement these functions. So this is going to return an object with get token, and this is the implementation for each function, right? So this is going to be an async function that is going to get the key. This is of type string, and let's have a try catch in here. So it's actually a good idea if we encounter an error getting this value. It's a good idea to try and delete it, right? So let's go ahead and say await secure store dot delete item async, passing the key, and then return null. Now let's try to get the item. So I'm gonna say const item equal to secure store dot get item async. This is going to need an await, and this needs the key. Let's return the item. Now, if we don't have an item, we need to, add something in the console to know that we don't have a cache session, for example, right? And let's go ahead and copy this, and let's say otherwise. We can say session restore from cache. Cool. All right, so this is how it looks. This is how the other functions should look like. So let's go ahead and copy this, and instead of get, let's say set or save, sorry. So to save the token, we need a key and a token of type string as well. So in this case, I'm going to, try to simplify this a bit by deleting everything and just say return secure store dot set item async, passing the key and value or token in this case. Yeah, and the save token, I think it's going to just return a void promise. Now, final delete token. Let's just try to move fast. Return secure store delete item async, passing the key. Okay, so this is not going to return anything, just void. Okay, let's go down here and export token cache. And this is going to be equal to the result of create token cache, right? Now we need to validate if we are using web. So if the platform OS is equal to web, then I want to return undefined. Otherwise, we can create the token cache. This is going to prevent web from trying to import this native module and break, right? Okay, so now that we have this really nice cache, we can just close this file, come back in here, and save the token by using our cache. So let's import token cache and then call save item, passing the key. The key is going to be access token. And actually, it would be a good idea to abstract this in our constants. So we can maybe duplicate this one and say token key name, for example. And I'm going to name this access token like this. So we can use now this token key. Okay, so this is expecting the token that we want to save, and we want to save the access token. Okay, cool. All right, so now at this point, we are setting the user. Once we get the response, so this should work just fine. Now we need to implement the actual, token endpoint. Let's go ahead and do that. And we also need to come back and implement the web part. So let's first of all go to the token. So first of all, let's get the body from the request. And this is going to come in the form data. Then we can get the code from the body. So I'm gonna say body.get. And I can cast this as a string. We also need to get the platform. So this is going to come in the body. Remember that we are only setting the platform for web. So we need to validate if we don't have this. This is going to be native by default. So let's go ahead and try to get the platform from the body. So I'm going to say body.get platform as string as well. Otherwise, this is going to be native. All right, so first of all, if we don't have a code, return response.json. First of all, error missing auth code. Secondly, status 400. So once we get the code on the backend, we can safely call Google API. So let's just create a simple fetch request that is going to look like this. And this is the endpoint for Google to get the token. And this is the Google endpoint. So we need to hit the token endpoint with a post request, and we need to set the headers to be form URL encoded. And this body needs to contain our client ID. So let's import the client, the secret, and the Google redirect URI from our constants. And then the grant type is going to be authorization code, meaning that we are passing the code so that Google can return the user info for this specific user, right? So once we get this, we can grab the data from this response by saying response.json like this. Now at this point, we can have another validation. So this data, I know that it has to contain an ID token. So this is the name of the field. And if we don't have an ID token, it means that something went wrong. So I'm going to return a response.json. Let's just return an error. We can say something like ID token wasn't received, something like that. And then we can pass a status of 400. Let's try to put this in one line and, oh, won't let me. Okay, so at this point, we should be able to get the user information from here. If we pass this if statement, it means that everything went well. And now we have the ID token, right? So what do we do with this ID token? First of all, we abstract the user information so that we can generate our custom JWT. So let's say user info is going to be equal to, and now let's use Jose. Let's import this in here as Jose from Jose. Okay, let's go back, and now in here I can say Jose.decode JWT, and let's pass the data.id token. This is going to be an object, so I'm just going to cast this as an object. So at this point, Google is going to return the data. So once we have this data, this is actually going to return, an object that is going to contain an expiration for this token. So I want to grab this expiration field and remove it from this object, since I'm going to be setting my own expiration for this token. So for the rest of this object, I'm going to call this user info without expiration, and this is going to be equal to the user info as any, because I don't have the type at this moment. Next, once I have this, I'm going to get the user ID, and the user ID, you can find it inside the user info. It's called sub. Then I'm going to define when this token was issued. So I'm going to say issued at, and then just the current time. And once we have this info, we can just go ahead and generate our own JWT. So I'm going to create this variable called access token, and then we can call Jose again and say sign JWT. I'm going to pass my user info without the expiration, and then I'm going to set the algorithm to be the standard 256, and then set the expiration time. Let's grab this from the constants. Set subject, this is going to be the user ID. Set issued at, this is when the token was issued. And then finally, we are signing this, okay? So basically, when we are passing this user info without the expiration, we are able to set our own expiration time, which is going to be in 20 seconds, I think right now. Yeah, 20 seconds, okay? And then we need to sign this token so that later when the user sends this token to authenticate request, we can validate that we signed this token using the JWT secret. So let's go ahead and import this. So we still have a couple things to do here. For example, if you want to handle a refresh token, this is a place where you need to create it. And also we need to check if the platform is equal to web. In this case, we want to set the token in the cookies and say return response.json. And I'm just going to return the access token. And this is how it looks. So now if we go to auth.tsx, finally, this is what we are getting in here in this response, and we are decoding the custom token that we are creating and just, setting the user. Now, just for testing, let's put this token in the console. So now let's just go ahead and refresh and see if this works. I'm going to sign in with Google, continue, select my account, and then continue. Then on the client, we are getting, the token, and this is how it looks. So this is my custom token, and actually I can just copy this, and we can go to jwt.io and just replace this and paste our token. And as you can see on the right, we can see the info for my user, my email verified, my sub, which is my ID, and some other stuff like my name, last name, and some important things is the expiration, which is going to be in 20 seconds, right? So this is going to expire right away. But yeah, just to get the idea that this is actually an ID token or JWT token that we can decode, and we're actually doing that in here and setting the user, meaning that now the user is authenticated, as you can see on screen, and we get a bunch of information. So if I go back to my index screen, now we are here, right? And we can actually display this, in a more nicer manner. But for now, we can say just ID. And by the way, we have the user fully typed, so I can just say name and hit save. And now I have my, Beto Morano. And I think this is going to be sub, right? Okay, so I need to map that correctly. The type is actually wrong, so we need to map the ID to be sub. It's a good idea to keep ID, I think. But yeah, I mean, we can access now the email, for example, and just start displaying the user info across the entire application just by using this nice and clean hook. So at this point, guys, we have the user info and we are even storing the token in the cache. So we should be able to restore the session using the same token. Now, before we work on restoring the session, let's actually implement the web version of this. Okay, guys, so I went ahead and opened the website, and this is how it looks, right? I just press W and open my website, and this is how it looks. The application is running in the localhost 8081, which matches our environment. If we go to the .env.local, this is actually the public base URL that we're using. So right now, let's just go ahead and close this. And we haven't implemented the logic for web. So right now, this I think won't work. I mean, the authentication request. So if I go ahead and press sign in, you can see that this is going to prompt me with my accounts. But once I select an account, this won't work since we are not handling web. So the first thing that I want to do is just go to the token API. So in the case of web, let's go ahead and create a new response. This is how it's going to look. We need to set the max age for the cookie. So expires at is going to be the exact same, time plus the cookie time, right? So we can actually double check this in our in our constants. So we set the cookie max age, which is going to be 20 seconds, which is, overkill. You have to change that. But yeah, so once we have the cookie max age, then we can append the token. So after this, I'm going to set the access token in the HTTP only cookie. Okay, so from this response, I'm accessing the headers and setting the cookie. Then for doing that, we need the cookie name. So let's import this from the constants. And then we also need the cookie options, right? Let's import these from the constants. And if you want to confirm how this looks, this is just setting this cookie with these options, and the max age is going to be the max age of the cookie, which is 20 seconds at the end of the day. Okay, then we have the grabbing just the options like the path, the HTTP only, secure, and same site. Okay, so that's it. Now, if you were to have a refresh token, you would need to create a different cookie for the refresh token. This is just for the access token. But yeah, so let's go ahead and hit save. And this should handle setting the cookie. So now on the response, let's go back to the auth.tsx. And inside this web if statement, first of all, let's grab the user data, which is going to come from the response above here. And once we have the user data, we are going to check if the user data was successful. So we can just say if success. Now using this user data, we could actually rename this to user data response. That would be, more, I think more easy to understand. But We are just checking if the response was successful, and then we're going to fetch the session to get the user data. Okay, so this ensures that we have the most up-to-date user information. And to handle the session for web, we're going to need to create a session endpoint, as you can see here, that I'm hitting with the method get, and then we are including the credentials and cookies. And based on that, we can return the session response. And once we have the session response data, we are going to set the user. So it's a bit different. Let's go ahead and create this session. I'm going to create a new file and just call this session plus api.ts. So this is going to be a get handler. I'm importing Jose, and then I'm importing as well the cookie name and JWT secret from the constants. And in this example, we have the constants in the root of the folder. So I'm going to create a try catch. For now, let's just put a console log. So if we have an error, I'm going to return a response, server error 500. We don't know what happened, so let's just return a 500. So the first thing that we need to do here is get the cookie from the header of the request. So we're accessing the header and we're getting the cookie. Then if we don't have a cookie, it means that the user is not authenticated, right? And we return 401. Next, we need to parse the cookie and get the attributes of this cookie. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and paste this piece of code. So this is what we are doing. We are parsing the attributes of the cookies. So we can just grab the cookie header and then split that. And for each cookie, we are going to trim the cookie. So here we are just checking if this is a cookie value pair or an attribute. And then we initialize the cookie entry if it doesn't exist. Okay, so we are just getting the info of the cookie, basically all the properties. And this is what this if statement is doing. Then we're also checking the HTTP only to handle the HTTP only attribute. Then we're handling the expires and max age attribute. So this piece of code is just grabbing the values, as you can see here, and all these values we're grabbing them from the cookie. So let's just go ahead and minimize this if statement, and this is how it looks. We're handling just those cases. So once we abstracted the information from the cookie, we can get the auth token from the cookie. So we are just validating if we have the cookie name and then the cookie name dot value. So if we don't have the cookie name and value, we are just going to return the user is not authenticated. If we pass this if statement, it means that we have a cookie. So everything is fine and we can grab the token from the cookies at position cookie name dot value. So once we have the token, guys, we can actually verify it. Okay, verify token. And I'm going to create a try catch for this. So if we have an error, we are going to return an invalid token response with 401. This also means that the token is invalid or expired. Okay, so inside the try, let's try to verify the token. First of all, I'm going to say await. Okay, and this is complaining, and this is because actually I need to move this up here. So actually this cookie, so actually this logic that we have in here, this is just a function and it should be closed like that. So if I go ahead and hit save now, this is how the format would look like. The await works because this is an async function. So it might be a good idea to actually abstract this into a helper function so that we don't have, this bunch of code in here. But yeah, once we have the token, we can verify that using Jose with the method verified, JWT verified. This is going to take the token and the JWT secret. By the way, Jose requires us to encode these secrets. That's why I'm using this encoder and then passing the secret. So if you remember when we issued the token, we signed the token. Once we get this token back from the client that is trying to authenticate, we can validate that we issued this token based on this JWT secret. Cool. So once we verified this, we need to verify the cookie expiration time. So we can simply do that by declaring a new variable and checking the max age of the cookie. So we grab the max age and then we calculate when the cookie will expire based on the max age. We don't exactly know when it was set, but we can estimate that using the tokens issued at claim if available. So we're grabbing the issued at from the payload, and then if we have it, we can simply set the cookie expiration to be it should add plus max aged. So after this, I can simply say return the user data from the token payload along with the expiration info. So here in short, we're just calculating when the cookie will expire, and then we're just appending this in the user data response. Let's go back to the auth.js and let's make sure that this is saved as well. And on the right, let's test this out. I just reloaded the website. Let's press sign in with Google. And by the way, I think it's a good idea if I come here to the application and then select cookies. And I'm going to remove everything to make sure that we are not, doing some weird things with other cookies that I had before. So I just refresh the website. Let's go ahead and sign in with Google, then select my account. This is going to, in this case, ask me if I want to provide my information. Let's go ahead and continue. And this is going to return me to the client. So let's check the console. And I did receive the token. Now let's go to the application again. I don't see the cookie. Let's go ahead and refresh. Okay, guys, and I just realized that I was actually missing this very important piece of code in here in the handle response. So for web, this is actually very important because we need to append the code verifier from the request object. This is the same verifier that was used to generate the code challenge, right? So once we get the request, we are appending this to the form data, and the field name is code verifier, and we can access this from the request that we are getting from Expo Auth session in here. Okay, guys, and another very small mistake actually in the token plus API. If we are validating that we are on web here, and I'm actually constructing the response correctly, but the response that I'm getting is actually for mobile devices, meaning that I forgot to return the response in this if statement. So if I just return the response now in this token API and close this means that now everything is going to work here when we are validating. We're going to get this user data, and then we're going to validate that we have this success field. So if I opened this again, just to double check that the response that we're going to get on web is going to have a success equal to true flag. So that's why I'm validating here. If we have this success, then we can, just do the session fetch, okay? And then include the cookies. Okay, so let's try this again. I'm going to reload everything and sign in with Google, then select my account, and boom. Okay, so at this time it works. Yeah, I have a couple of warnings about the cross-origin, but that's okay. So let's go to the application, and now we can see the auth token. This is the name of the cookie that we set, and this is how the cookie looks like, okay? So we also have the network, and we can confirm that after getting the token. Now in web, we're getting the correct response. And finally, we are just fetching for the session, and this session is going to be refreshing with a new expiration each time that we refresh it. Okay, cool. And now I can see the data about the user. And if I reload the website, I'm going to lose the state. So let's try to restore the session. We're working right now on web, so let's keep working on web to restore the session. Now to restore the session, guys, on web, it's actually pretty easy since we're using cookies. So to do that, let's go ahead and create a use effect. And I want to run this, use effect every time that the platform changes. So let's go ahead and put this in here. Now let's create a function inside this use effect called restore session. This is going to be an arrow function. Asynchronous is not going to get any parameters. And then after we create this function, I'm going to right away call it in here. Cool, so let's add a try catch in case we have an issue. I'm just going to put it in the console for now. And this is how it looks. Now inside the try, first of all, I want to do a couple things. Let's set the isLoading variable equal to true, first of all. And then let's add a finally down here that is going to set the isLoading. So let me just go ahead and copy this line and set this to false. We can check if we have a user authenticated by creating a fetch request to the session endpoint. So let's call this variable session response, and let's just do an await, and let's do a simple fetch to our base URL. So let me create a variable in here. I'm gonna say base URL slash API slash auth slash session. Okay, this is our endpoint for web. So first of all, let's validate if this is actually web. We want to do this. Otherwise, we need to handle mobile, right? So let's add an else statement and let's handle this in a moment. So this endpoint, it's going to handle a get method, right? So we need to specify this in the request. But also something important is we have to say include credentials. This includes cookies in the request. Now let's check this session response. If it's okay, then we can grab the data. So I'm gonna say const user data equal to await session response dot JSON, and then finally I can set the user with the user data as auth user, and this should do it actually. So let's go ahead and hit save. Now let's refresh the website, and as you notice, now this is failing. Let's see. Not authenticated. Okay, let's try again. I'm going to sign in with Google and then, sign in. Okay, and this time works. And if I refresh, you can see that the session gets restored. And this actually should last, I think, 20 seconds. So let's try and see. I'm going to keep reloading. Okay, and after 20 seconds, you can see that now we are not authenticated. So at this point, the user needs to authenticate again to have, access again. So we can authenticate, and if I refresh, we can restore because the cookie is still valid. Okay, so that's for web. Let's go ahead and minimize this if statement. And now let's handle mobile. So for mobile or native, we can use the token cache to determine if we have an access token. And I just realized, guys, that I have a typo. So this is token yeah, this is a typo, so I need to fix that later. But yeah, so I'm going to use this utility to get the token, and we are passing the token name. And actually, if you remember, we created a constant for the token key name. So it's a good idea to use that in here instead of hard coding this string. So let's go ahead and remove this and paste this in here. And that's the token that I'm going to try to get for, the mobile app. So I can just add a note here, refresh token if needed. Okay, then you would have a validation, something like if we have an access token, it means that we can, try and restore the session. Else, I'm going to put in the console user is not authenticated. So if we do have a stored access token, I'm going to create a try catch and then just a console log with the error in case we have one. So if we have a token, we want to actually decode this token, right? So I can say decoded equal to, let's use Jose, decode JWT. This is going to take the stored access token, which is the JWT. Now at this point, I'm not going to check if this token has expired. I'm just going to go ahead and set the user. So let's set the user from the decoded data as auth user, of course. And we want to set as well the access token variable from the stored access token. Okay, and this is complaining because type of string is not assignable to a type of undefined, right? So let's go ahead and just say that this is going to be a string, and that should get rid of that warning. Now we have access to the token in case, we need it, and we're actually going to need it in a moment. And as you notice, this is working fine. Now, of course, this token is not valid anymore, right? Because it's going to expire in 20 seconds. So what we need to do here is actually validate the expiration of this token. So what I can do is just, for example, check the expiration field, and then graph a now value, right? To compare that. So the expiration needs to be greater to now, meaning that the token is still active. So in this case, we can set the access token and set the user. Otherwise, we will need to refresh the token, right? So that means that the token has expired, but we have to refresh the token. So in this case, I'm not going to be creating this else. I'm just going to, check if the token has expired, and actually otherwise I'm just going to sign out the user. So in this case, because I don't want to deal with refreshing the token right now, I'm just going to say set user equal to null. meaning that we don't have a user. And also let's clear the local storage. So let's use the cache. Let's use the token cache dot delete token, and let's pass the key of this token. So let's pass the token key name, and yeah, so we're going to delete that from the cache because now this is not valid. So let's go ahead and hit save. And now as you can see, if I reload, the session is not valid. So let me just go ahead and open the the terminal and reload, and you can see that we don't have a cache session and user is not authenticated. If I sign in again, we should be able to enter into this if statement and set the user. So let me try and sign in again. I'm going to select my user, and boom, we have data, right? Now this is going to be valid for 20 seconds, meaning that if I close the app or just reload the app, as you can see here, we're going to be able to restore the session because the token is not expired yet. And we're able to set the access token and set the user. If the token has expired, then we want to log out the user. Of course, in an ideal world, if the access token is expired, you want to then fall back to try and use the refresh token to get a new access token. And if that didn't work, if the refresh token is expired as well, at that point you have to sign out the user and the user has to sign in again. And also the requests that you made are going to fail as well. So let's go ahead and hit save. Let's reload. And as you notice, my session has expired, meaning that I just cleared everything and the user has not access anymore. Okay, so now this is working, guys. Let's go ahead and actually clear this a little bit. I'm going to close everything. And then what I want to do now is actually be able to create APIs that are protected, meaning that only authenticated users can access them. So for that, we actually created, if you remember, a function in here that we called fetch with auth, right? And we have a warning here that we haven't resolved. So this is going to be a higher order function that is going to basically return a fetch method that we can use to just pass the path of the API that I want to fetch. And it's going to include the cookies for web, and it's going to include the token for native. And then based on this, we can create kind of like a middleware or another higher order function that is going to protect some of the APIs that I want to protect, because you might want to have some public APIs. So the ones that you want to protect, we can wrap them into this function and then validate if the cookie is valid or if the token is valid. Okay, so let's go ahead and create this higher order function. Since we are using cookies for web and token for native, let's go ahead and check if it's web, then handle this accordingly. Otherwise, handle this for native. So to make a request with cookies, first of all, we can just simply call fetch, passing the endpoint options of the request that we are getting in here, and then credentials set it to include. This is going to include the cookies in the request, and that's it. At this point, we could return the response, but just so that you know, if the response status is 401, it means that the request failed, and 401 means that the refresh token is expired. So right now what we can do is try and refresh the token, but in this case we are not going to handle this. So after you refresh the token, this function I'm not going to include it, but once you refresh the token, if you are implementing a refresh token logic, you would need to try again and fetch, okay? But in this case, we are not handling for this tutorial, but the example down below is going to cover all this. So if you want to take a deeper look, just go ahead and check that out. But yeah, at this point, I'm just going to return the response. And that's it for web. Super simple, right? Now for native, we need to set the token in the header of the request. So we can simply call the fetch with the URL and options, but the headers are going to be a bit different. And TypeScript is complaining because I set these options to be optional, and I actually want them to be required so that we don't have to, I mean, you could validate accordingly, but at this point I'm going to pass them all the time. So yeah, at this point I can just return the response. Once basically the only thing that this function is doing is adding the correct headers for each platform, right? Now again, guys, if you want to have a refresh logic, you will have to check in here if response is 404 or 401, sorry, you need to refresh. So I'm going to add a note in here. Okay, so at this point, I'm just going to return the response, and that should do it. Okay, so we cannot use this quite yet. First of all, we need to have some protected routes, right? So let's go to the API and create a new folder called protected. This folder is going to contain all my APIs that I want to protect. So I want to protect some data. I'm going to call this API data plus API.ts. So this API is going to be a get handler, but I need to somehow protect this, right? So inside my utilities, I'm going to create a new file called middleware.ts. And I'm going to paste some code, but don't worry, let's walk through it together. First of all, let's import some constants. I'm going to be using Jose and then the cookie name. I already have this type, so we don't need it in here. And instead, we can import that. So let me just go ahead and import this from the context where I defined that. So just a note that I want to make sure that everyone understand is that this is not actually like a middleware in the traditional sense. This function acts as a high order function that adds authentication to the API handlers. So this is a function that I'm creating here called with auth, and it's going to take the handler as parameter. So this is a wrapper function, right? So this handler is going to get the request, is going to get the user. So this is super nice because all the APIs that I'm wrapping with auth are going to have context of the user that is making the request. So for example, if a user hits an API called get profile, for example, then we can say, okay, this user with ID something created the request. So I can say, this user ID, increase the usage or get the user by ID or get their information. And that is super useful. So this is returning a function, as you can see here, with just wrapping the request, and it's going to return a promise with the response. So we're creating a try catch, and then we are getting the token, right? We're defining the token. So first we try to get the token from the authorization header, and this is for native applications. So we're just grabbing that from the headers, and if we don't have a token, we can simply, try and get that from the cookies, because it could be that it is in the cookies. So in here, we're just getting the cookie in case that we don't find a token for native. And if we have a cookie header, we are parsing the cookies, okay? And then we get the token from the cookie, and that's it. Once we have the token, we can use that. So if we don't have a token, meaning that if it could be native or web, if we don't have a token, we are going to return authentication required, or something more meaningful if you want to change this error. Then the second thing that we need to do is verify this token. So I'm going to be using my JWT secret. And if we don't have a JWT secret from our environment variables, I'm going to say server misconfiguration. Now, the next thing that I want to do once I have the token, and we need to verify that we issued this token. So I'm just using Jose with the JWT verify, and I'm verifying that I issue this token using my JWT secret. Here I have another note that says that Jose requires you to encode the secret key manually. That's why we have this kind of weird syntax. But yeah, so once we have verified that we issued this token, this is actually going to return me the payload of this token. So I can simply return the handler, which is the function that is going to handle my post or get request, and pass the request plus the user or the decoded payload, okay? And then I'm just catching this in a nice manner in case we have an error. I'm validating using Jose errors, because Jose is going to let me know if the token is expired, right? So if the token is expired, it's very important that you return a 401 so that the client tries to refresh the token and create the request again, in case you want to implement refresh logic. So I'm returning 401, especially for the JWT expired and JWT invalid. And finally, if none of those were the case, I'm going to return just an auth error with a 500 status. Okay, so this is a super nice middleware function that then I can use to wrap my protected routes. So I'm going to create a super simple get handler. So this is going to look a bit different. In this case, I'm exporting again the get method, which is what the with auth is going to return. And with auth is going to get me the request and the user, right? So which is super nice is that inside of this, I can, have any logic like get user by ID or get post by ID. And you can simply grab that from the user that we're getting in here. And this is going to be fully typed, right? So you can access the entire info of the user on the server, which is super nice. So I'm just simply returning the response with the mock data, which is just super simple, secret data that I created here, plus the user who created this request. So let's go ahead and hit save. And now we should be able to access this API. So the way we use this, let me just go ahead and go back in here. Okay, so if I go to the auth.tsx, I still have this warning. And let me just go ahead and double check that I'm typing this correctly. Yes, and this actually is not correct. I'm using async, which is not needed in here. And these options are required. So I'm going to just remove the question mark. And then I can scroll down and we don't have the warning anymore. And also remember that we can access this fetch with auth using our use auth hook. So let's go to the index app and then I can simply create a new button, for example. So let's say fetch protected data, right? And then we can, create a, let's use this with auth fetch. And then I can create a function in here. So this is going to be an async function and let's call get protected data. So I'm not going to pass any parameters in here. So as well, I'm just going to have a response equal to await and then fetch with auth. And this is going to get the endpoint, which should be the base URL plus, slash API slash, in this case, is going to be protected slash data. Now, this takes as well a second parameter, which is going to be the options for the request. And for the options, I just want to specify the method, which is going to be actually a get. So if I hit save, this should work. Now, let's grab the data from the response. So I'm gonna say await response.json. And let's store this data in a variable. So I'm gonna say const data equal to set data. And let's use state for this. Okay, and then we can set the data down here. So I'm gonna say set data equal to data. Again, this is just protected data, right? And I'm just gonna, duplicate this and pass directly a JSON.stringlify of the data. So if I hit save, this should do it. So I'm going to call this get protected data once I press this button. Again, the user needs to be authenticated. But yeah, overall, this is fairly clean on the component. Let's go ahead and try to sign in. And I will have 20 seconds to create an authenticated request. Okay, and it works, as you can see. So if I actually keep getting this data, you can see that the timestamps is updating. And yeah, even if I refresh, I can still get data because I still have a couple of seconds. Okay, so at this point, my token should be expired. And if I fetch again, you can see that I get the error token expired, which is super nice because then you could actually refresh the token, right? And refresh the session of the user. But of course, at this point, I cannot access protected data. And if I reload the application, I'm going to be logged out. Okay, guys, so just to finish, let's go ahead and sign out the user. And this is actually not needed. We should be able to call this directly like this. And if I go back to the auth, we have this sign out somewhere in here. Okay, here it is. So the sign out is actually going to be super simple. First of all, you want to clear the cookie and token. And also we want to set the state to be null, right? So this is how the sign out is going to look. Let me just change this to be the name of my variable with a typo. But yeah, so overall, I had the delete as well, the refresh token. That is super important if you want to sign out the user. Then I'm setting the access token to be, I think it could be just an empty string in this case and remove the other one. So for web, we need to actually call the logout endpoint. And this is because we need to clear the cookie. So let's go to the API and let's create inside the auth, let's create a logout plus api.ts. And just so that this video is not super long, I'm going to paste this in here. And I'm just using, my utilities. The only thing that we need to do here is just make sure that we are setting the cookie to be an invalid one, right? So we clear the cookie, and this is how we clear the access token. This is a post request. We are, initializing a new response with success equal to true. And then I'm just setting the header to be, the same that we had before, but the max age is going to be 0, meaning that the cookie is expired. And you need to do the same for the refresh token if you are handling the refresh logic. Otherwise, just return the response. And let's go ahead and hit save. And let's try this out on web. Okay, so here we have our website. And actually, if I try to refresh, you can see that we are trying to get the session, but the user is not authenticated, which means this is going to fail. Now let's actually authenticate the user. And boom, I have my data. All right, so now if I fetch protected data, you can see that this is working fine. And we can also see the request down here, which is super cool. And after a moment, I can sign out again, which means we are, hit the logout. This is going to return a success, and it's going to set the cookie to be expired. So right now, if I refresh, I'm going to remain signed out, which is super nice. So let's continue again. And we can fetch data. So now I'm going to wait 20 seconds and let's try to fetch the data again so that we validate that we are getting the cookie expired or token expired error. Okay, I think 20 seconds have passed, and as you notice, now the data is failing because the middleware function is preventing us from hitting the API with an invalid token. How cool is that? Okay guys, so we made it till this point where we are ready to deploy our application. So far everything works locally, but now let's go ahead and deploy. So deploying should be fairly easy, but we have a couple things to consider, especially if we have an integration with Google. So we're going to need to have a couple of extra steps. First of all, the first thing that you need to do when you want to deploy, since we're going to be using Expo application services and specifically a hosting service. So first of all, make sure that you have the EAS CLI installed in your machine. You can double check by just running npm install globally EAS CLI and hit enter. This is going to install the latest version in case you don't have the latest one. And if you don't have CLI, it's going to install it. Okay, after a moment, you can see that now if I run EAS-V, I get my EAS CLI version, which at the time is 16. Okay, so let's go ahead and clear the terminal. The next thing that we want to do is export. Since we want to deploy the API as well as our website, we need to export this. So I'm gonna say npx expo export and then passing the platform web like that and hit enter. So as you notice, this is actually loading the environment variables, meaning that everything that we have defined in our env file is going to be accessible in our API routes as well as in our website. Okay, so a couple things to consider is that at this time, our base URL, it's localhost, so we need to change that, right? Another thing to notice here is that we have generated basically two applications. One is going to be our web, and the other one is going to be our backend, and these are our API routes. So I'm gonna say EAS deploy and hit enter. This is all we need to do. Now this is going to create an EAS project for me. So I'm gonna say yes in here, okay? And what this is going to do, it's actually going to create a project. So if I go to expo.dev and refresh my page, you can see that now I have this Google OAuth video, which I can select and, go in and make some changes if I want to. So the next thing is super important is asking me for a preview URL for my project. So I'm going to select the default Google OAuth video, and this is going to be a free domain that we get just by using Expo. So this is my domain. So we can just go ahead and copy this. And for the production one, what I want to do is come here and replace this. And now this is going to be actually an HTTPS domain. Okay, so this is my domain. And since I deploy right now, this is going to be in a preview domain that I can access and double check that works just fine. If you want, you can just copy this link And then let's come here, paste it in here. And this is my deployed website in a preview. So it's working fine. Now that I have my domain for production, it is this one. We can actually just close this and go ahead and deploy directly to production. Now this is the only thing that we needed, right? But before I actually do that, I'm going to copy this domain and let's go to Google. And if you remember, we have this information in our application. So let's go to the clients and we created this Expo backend client, right, with Google. And we need to authorize our new URL in here. So I'm going to paste this link in here and then let's add a new one down here. And let's copy this path because at the end of the day, it's going to be the same. The only thing that is changing is the domain since this is going to be now deployed. So if I hit save now, let's just click in here and double check that everything looks fine. Now my deployed domain should have access, or my deployed application should have access to sign in with Google. Okay, so we have that in there. And then we also have this public base URL. Because I changed the environment variable, I need to say npx expo export platform web. And then I'm going to pass the C flag to make sure that we don't have any cache, right? And this is going to load again the environment variables to create these bundles. That way we can make sure that the latest environment variables are going to be included. Okay, so that's done. Now I can run again EAS deployed production, hit enter. And let me go ahead and this is the deploy one. So let's wait a minute. Okay, and that was actually fairly fast. So after deploying again, guys, I can just go ahead and sign in with Google. And this is going to work just fine. But at this point, we are using now the deploy domain, which is super cool. So I can select my account the same way that we did before, and we're able to authenticate, which is super cool. Okay, so that's it. Basically, you just need to set the public base URL once you deploy, which is super easy. Then redeploy your app or just set the base URL before you deploy for the first time, and that should work as well. And finally, guys, I want to also mention that when you are going to deploy your web application, actually Google requires you to provide some information in the landing page of your website, okay? So this is going to be deployed on web, Android, and iOS. So you need to add, and let me show you an example. This is another example. This is an Expo app that I created myself. And as you notice, I also have sign in with Google. So if you only have like the sign in with Google similar to the application, actually Google is going to reject your website since you have to add like a title and then like a description explaining some of the features of what this website is doing, right? So keep that in mind. You have to add some information about your application. And another thing to keep in mind before going to production is that you actually have to go to the verification center in here. And when you go to production, you're gonna need to verify this. So actually Google provides, if you click on this learn more, they are going to take you to this page, which is going to explain a couple of things that you need to include in your application, like the app logo and requirements for the logo and things like that. But something important is that you're going to need a domain. And once you have a domain, you actually need to verify this domain with Google. And if I click on verify domain, this is going to let you know more information about how you can verify the domain. So to verify your domain, once you have one, you're gonna need to add a TXT record. And you can do that, with your domain provider. And this is how the record should look like. Just the type is going to be TXT, and then you have to leave the host blank or just put an @ and then enter the verification code that Google is going to give you. So once you do that, your application should be verified. And for example, let me show you how this would look once your application is verified. This is how it looks. And actually, if you try to just submit your application without all the requirements, Google is going to send you an email and then you can troubleshoot with them and get it fixed. So this is the shopping list app that I was showing you before. And something cool, once you have this deployed and verified, is that you can track some metrics of how many people are using your application. So in this case, I have 3 users. One of them is me. But yeah, that's it. So after this, for mobile, of course, if I just went ahead and start the server, now we're going to be using this public base URL, which should work for native the same way that is working for web. Now, the only thing to consider is that if you created a build, you're gonna need to create a new one with the production URL, right? If you want to learn more about how you can actually automate changing this based on the environment of your application, make sure to check out some of the videos that we have here in the channel that actually explain that in detail. And that brings us till the end of this video, guys. I know it was super comprehensive and long, but I think this is a really nice resource because it allows you to own your authentication. It allows you to extend this to more providers if you want to, and even extend and tweak the functionality, because what I showed you is just one way of doing things. If you want, you can tweak some things like the code exchange. You can do it on the server. Instead of sending the code to the client, you can integrate the refresh logic, or you can only have one token like I did in here and just provide access for 7 days, let's say, or 30 days, and then just have the cookie and token expired and have the user authenticate again. And even the user, can authenticate with Google, which is super nice. They don't have to type any password, so authenticating the user a couple times per month should be okay. We also cover how to protect our API routes. This is very important because sometimes you need to have server-side logic, like for example, to send an email, to update a record on the database, and you also need to have the context of the authenticated user that is making the request. So we created the helper middleware that it handles that for us, and it's going to keep our APIs protected. So I really hope you like this video. I really enjoyed making this video as well, and I learned a lot. Please let me know what you think in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe, give it a like, and I'll see you in the next one.